Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here with me today. My name is Geoff Bruskin. I'm the managing partner of White Tiger Connections. We are a consulting firm specializing in mergers and transactions for the mergers and acquisitions, excuse me, for the lower and the lower middle market. Topic of today's webinar, we're going to talk about valuations across different industry segments. And we're just going to dive right into it today. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat here below. Um, so valuations across industry segments in the low market. First thing we need to define is what is the low market? Low market in our nomenclature here at White Tiger is anything that's underneath 1 million in gross revenue. Million in gross revenue is the threshold where if you're north of that, you have, in theory, enough freestanding cash flow in your business, enough adjusted EBITDA, we might call it, where you have the ability to start to look at your practice more dimensionally, and buyers can start to look at your practice more dimensionally. If you are just under 1 million in gross revenue, low market, and the reason for that is because there's not enough infrastructure and there's not enough cash flow in your business for a buyer really to do anything that's massively creative and dimensional with it. It's more of an additive acquisition at its best. So that's the kind of delineation of the low market. Lower middle market tends to start somewhere around million in gross revenue up to 1 million in EBITDA, right? So if it's 2 million in gross, 1 million in EBITDA, anywhere, it's kind of a gray area where exactly the lower middle market begins. But that's the delineation. As for different industry segments and how these affect valuations, when we're in the low market, which is really what we're talking about today, valuations tend to range between 0.8 and 1.7 times gross revenue. So 0.8, less than 1 times gross revenue, you're really only going to see that in exceptional cases. If the business needs a lot of reform, if the owner is, gets unwell medically, and it's the wife who is trying to, or the husband who's trying to sell the business, kind of the distressed sort of situation is really usually the only time where you would see below 1 times gross revenue for the sale of a practice. Another situation where you would see below 1 times gross revenue is if it is a cash deal. So usually, and we're going to talk about this in a couple minutes, deals in the low market, and frankly, all over, seldom what we see today at White Tiger, we don't see cash deals very often. We will see anywhere between 10 and 67% of cash down. Average is probably about 50% of cash down. 33% to 50% is average across different industry segments. And it's because if a seller is selling their business, a lot of the time, especially in professional services, which is a lot of where we play, you're selling goodwill. And so the owner, the seller's continuity in that the combination of the firms is really essential to assure there's client stickiness and to assure that the buyer is getting what they pay for. And then the rest of the payout is, you could call it seller financed, you could call it an earnout in order to achieve the valuation that was discussed, pre-sale. So 0.8 to 1.7 times gross revenue is what we typically see for under 1 million in EBITDA, but I've seen 0.5, I've seen 0.7, I've seen 0.8 for those kind of distressed situations, or for more cash up front. That's typically how that goes. The average, 1 to 1.5 is really the average for evaluation on gross revenue. The more 1 times gross revenue practices, think about practices that are either seasonally intensive in their collections. If we talk about an accounting firm, for example, tax season, right? If you do a lot of tax work, more likely to be closer to 1 times revenue. If you run a landscaping business and most of your businesses, or you open pools, or anything that's seasonally intensive from a collection standpoint, is going to be closer to 1 times revenue. Whereas the subscription-based practices that have healthy, consistent, freestanding cash flow throughout the year, collections throughout the year, those are going to be closer to 1.5. Which is that average, the 1 to 1.5, in that range in the low market. Um, Other things that kind of bring you up closer to the higher end of average 1.5, the more remote your practice is in this crazy world that we live in today, where there's not enough talent, especially not enough competent talent. Um, it's much better to have a practice where your infrastructure is such that you can recruit people, especially skilled labor, who has industry experience doing what you need them to do on a remote basis. Even if you have a like construction or light manufacturing or landscaping or anything that requires physical labor. It's better to have your corporate infrastructure be remote. And if not remote, digital, right? So what's the difference? Well, if we take an accounting firm as an example, if your clients have been trained into coming into the office to meet with your staff, that's not really the best. You're going to have a harder time selling that at a higher multiple because buyers want to see things that are streamlined. They want workflow streamlined, staff streamlined. Um, you know, and and when I say that, I don't mean to imply that the culture of what makes your small business, right? We're talking about businesses under 1 million, so these are small, the mom and pops, the SMBs of the world. We don't want to cannibalize what makes you you. Absolutely not. But at the same time, if there's a way that we can preserve what makes you you and create the systems and the processes that the buyers are going to be looking for in order to maximize your valuation, that's the best case scenario. So that's some of the work that we do with sellers in a pre-sale capacity to help get them ready for a prosperous outcome and have them retain what makes them special. Um, North of 1.5, we don't see too often. That 1.7, it's got to be a really choice practice. Another thing that can take it to 1.5, potentially even beyond, is if the adjusted EBITDA, essentially net profit, right, is going to be really, really high as a ratio to gross profit. So I spoke to a business owner this morning. It's an IT company, IT managed services, doing about 900,000 in top line revenue. Including his salary, he's taking home about 600,000 a year. So he takes like $100,000 base essentially, and then distributions that are left over is almost 500,000. So 600 is, the adjusted number, the essentially his true profit line. And that's outstanding, right? We're talking about a 67% profit margin for the practice. That's really attractive. So, certainly that level of profitability is going to get him up closer to that 1.5 number, potentially even a little bit higher if he was willing to accept less cash down, right? So, we deal with sellers who want different things. Some sellers are selling because they are burnt out, they're ready to get out of the practice as soon as humanly possible. And we always will see at least a 90-day integration period where the seller has to retain some level of involvement. Because especially in services businesses where you're buying goodwill, that's essential to maximize the likelihood of client stickiness, typically longer than 3 months. But even in product driven businesses, the businesses that are relatively turnkey, having the seller on call to the buyer and available to the buyer is going to be pretty important during some level of an integration period, because there's just no way that you can anticipate for all of the different moving pieces that the buyer is going to need to take over and keep the integrity of the business, the clients, the staff, the technology, the workflows, everything intact as best as possible, inventory, you name it. Um, More often, what we see is a period of like 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, sometimes even longer of integration. But a year is like a healthy minimum that we like to see. This guy who I spoke with this morning, $900,000 IT practice, 600 in net. Um, he's willing to stay on board for a year, which is fantastic because the structure of the deal that I ran by him that I think he's really open to is we're targeting a 1.5 times multiple on the gross revenue. So call it like 1,350,000, somewhere in there is what we're trying to get. And he's willing to accept 50% of cash down, which is great. So he's gonna get, 650, 675 nut on closing of the transaction, which will be great. And then he's going to stay involved for a year, helping the buyer to assimilate his practice into theirs. It's almost definitely going to be another IT company because low market, it's really below the threshold of what private equity or a family office is going to want to look at. It's going to take another IT company to buy that. And the reason for that, and this is also kind of the delineation between the low market and the lower middle market, is, as you can imagine, $600,000 net profit. This gentleman is doing everything himself, right? He's the business, really. He's got a few support staff, but he's the business. The reason why a private equity firm or a family office or any kind of institutional, even small institutional buyer would look at that practice, even in a parallel industry, let's say a $10 million marketing firm wants to expand into IT, or if we're talking about $1 million carpentry company, if you're doing electric and you want to expand into carpentry, you're not going to buy that business if you don't already have at least one leader who's going to be able to take over in that same vertical, right? So under $1 million revenue, it's typically really the owner who is the business. The business is, they're the nucleus of the business rather than being the executive of the business with a turnkey sort of infrastructure underneath them. That's what more of the institutional or the parallel industry investors look for when they buy a practice. Low market, you're going to be buying, you're only buying it if you're in that business already. You're buying the customers, you're buying the inventory, you're buying what infrastructure, staff, technology does exist. Most of all, you're buying the customers. That's really what you want. You want to try to keep whatever makes that business unique intact, because obviously the customers have a good experience with you. But so for this IT gentleman, he's excited about taking 50% of cash down from another IT company. Maybe it'll be a $3 million IT company that buys his basically $1 million business. And he's going to stay involved over the year and help clients get comfortable with the new ownership. And he's going to take his payout over, the other 50% over the next year. And he gets to fulfill his goal, which is immediately on closing, he's going to go from working 60 to 80 hours a week down to probably working 20 to 40, because the handover is going to start probably 40 to 50 actually in the first quarter. And then we're going to see it gradually diminish. But he's ready to get out. So this is, when we start working with a client, we hypothesize what we feel is the best deal structure. And then so we kind of reverse engineer it based on what the lifestyle preference of the seller is looking for. Because at the end of the day, it's our job to educate the seller about the different options that exist. Well, if you wanted to stay involved for 3 years, here's a strategy that we might look at. If you're willing to stay involved for only a year, we should probably be looking at this strategy. And that's what we do. We try to get into that level of depth. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what's the best time to start talking with you if we're evaluating selling our business? And the answer is, it is never too soon. The sooner that we have a conversation, the sooner that I can advise you on what the directionality of your business is and that you're taking. And if there are any strategies that you can employ over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, or whatever the timeline that you're thinking about is, so that you're positioning yourself for a more profitable exit if and when it does happen for you. Hope that was helpful to you. This is true across markets. The topic of today's webinar was industry valuations across market segments in the low market. And that 0.8 to 1.7, 1 to 1.5 times gross revenue is really the average of what we see in different industry segments for under $1 million in revenue. We do mostly work with public accounting firms at White Tiger Connections, but the reason why we work with public accounting firms is because public accounting firms are great referral sources. So as we build out partnerships and trust and we help our public accounting network sell, they often have a first look into their clients that are selling their businesses. And we like to be able to support their clients. And certainly with the help of a committed accountant as a partner, that makes our job a lot easier, and we compensate the accountant accordingly. All right, everybody. Thank you for your time. Have a tremendous weekend. You can always email me if you have questions at jeff@whitetigerconnections.com, or just directly from our website, which is www.whitetigerconnections.com. You can book time on my calendar. You can submit a form and ask a question. Have a great weekend. Thanks for attending.